Hi everyone, welcome to our panel on how does academic culture, structure and assessment impact on student mental health. We're going to be looking at the whole picture when it comes to academic culture, as in what universities are doing, how that's affected by the students and mental health. Rachel Piper, she's a Youth Engagement Officer for Child Outcomes Research Consortium and a part-time MA student, is going to be the chair for today, and she's going to introduce the rest of the panellists for you.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really exciting to see so many people on board to talk about this topic. So yeah, as Lesley mentioned, I'm currently working in youth engagement at a research organisation called Cork. And prior to that, I was working at Student Minds in policy. And so it's really exciting to be here and dipping my toe back into this topic. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about how the webinars will be running today. So we're going to have 2-minute speeches from each of the panelists in response to a question that I'll ask them. Then there'll be space for you to ask your questions, and you can do that in the chat or on Twitter. And if you're not able to access the chat, please do let someone know, and you can just like unmute if you're unable to type. Yeah, we're going to be having that open panel discussion and then that Q&A from you all. So please introduce yourself in the chat box and ask the panel questions throughout, and we'll be filtering it through, so no particular time that you need to ask that. Obviously, we're talking about topics that can be quite distressing or sensitive to people. So if you do feel distressed by any of the content, we have a mental health first aider on hand, Laura Beswick, who you can contact via private message in the chat box. And there are also some support lines that are going to be appearing on the screen and in the chat. So there are also, if you do get really interested in what one particular panelist is speaking about, there are pre-recorded interviews and talks with them and their research papers available on the SMaRteN website. And you will have received a link to that in your email. And just a final little piece, a couple more pieces of housekeeping. So one is that you can tweet along with us, hashtag SMaRteNconf, nice and short, CONF. And please complete this poll that we're going to be sharing that's going to be posted up. And just to let you know, whilst you're completing that this session is going to be recorded and available to watch again on the Mental Health YouTube channel and also on the SMaRteN website. Just a minute here to complete this poll to say whether you're a student, researcher, clinician, teacher or lecturer, or the elusive other. Okay, great. So it's really exciting to see that there is quite a large number of researchers here. Equally, I'm thrilled that lots of students are here to kind of input your lived experience. And yeah, I think this range of clinicians, teachers and lecturers are going to have a lot to say, and I'm curious about who else is here. So if you're not fitting into one of these categories, please do let us know in the chat what your interest is and what brings you here. So I'm going to go on to introduce our panel members. So our first panel member is Cameron Williams. Cameron is a researcher and project manager at the Black Dog Institute. So Cameron, I'm going to ask a little bit about your work, but particularly how can we best optimise students' wellbeing capabilities or soft skills, as it were, such as resilience? And more specifically, what role does the university culture play in this development? And why should we aim to develop a positive or healthy university? Over to you.
Thank you, and thanks so much for having me on the session. Really appreciate it. Yeah, so it's a big question to deal with. Universities have obviously recently, had a growing interest and investment in, workshops, training courses, etc., to boost student wellbeing, and that's amazing. Resilience workshops, workshops to deal with perfectionism, imposterism, etc., and that's really brilliant. And we need more of that. But my research is really focused on the broader university academic culture. So what I mean by that is, you know, a lot of these factors around curriculum, a lot of the factors around social networks for students, but also, you know, even instructor and university staff well-being themselves. What my research in a very, very small nutshell has shown is that these whole of university factors and you know, again, draw upon the UK mental health university framework when we're talking about these university culture factors. But these factors actually seem to predict a lot of these soft skills that we really want to boost in students, you know, the resilience, the self-compassion, you know, reduced levels of procrastination, increased mindfulness, etc. So it really seems that rather than just having, you know, a smaller focus, let's take a larger focus. And again, I've probably run out of time, but in terms of, you know, why should we bother to do that? I probably don't need to preach to the choir here too much because, you know, I think we're all quite aware that, you know, mental health distress affects, you know, up to 85% of students. Massive links there in terms of educational outcomes. Drop out, you know, 1/3 of students drop out before graduating. And then finally, these soft skills influence future career outcomes. You know, so it's really important for personal as well as kind of educational and career trajectories. So yeah, thank you. And please feel free to email me as well if you have any questions.
Thank you. I think that's a really good oversight. I'm sure people who want to dig in more about that can ask questions in the chat. So next up is Dr. Sally Kift, a Deputy Vice Chancellor at James Cook University. Sally, over to you. Oh, sorry, Michael. I will ask you a question because that will give you a little bit more to go on. So yeah, so what practical things do you believe university educators can do in how they design assessment to better support student mental health and well-being?
Thanks for that, Rachel, and hello everyone from Australia, as Cameron was. I think we could be much clearer and more explicit about what assessment at university entails. So for example, firstly, I think we could devote explicit course time to helping students understand the terminology, expectations and processes associated with higher education assessment so that they can be successful and confident learners. And we would call that assessment literacies. We would call those understandings assessment literacies. Secondly, I think we could tend also to the explicit development of students' feedback literacy. So what I mean by that is what feedback is and how best to use it. There's been some good recent research that suggests that there's 4 interrelated elements about appreciating feedback processes. So that's the first one. So the value of feedback and students' active role in it. Making judgments so students understand about the quality of their own work and that of others, managing the emotional impact of feedback, which I think is critically important and might be an area for further research, and taking action, acting productively on the feedback that they receive. And my third point would be, I think we could be much more careful about how we design our first assessment of students in their first year at university. Again, research has shown that students' sense of belonging in higher education is linked very much to the experience of early assessment success or failure. I'm not quite sure that as academics, when we've got the big picture in front of us, we focus as much as we might on that very first piece of critical assessment and the effect it might have on our students. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Sally. I think one thing that comes across in that that's really interesting and perhaps people can pick up a bit later is how we might change what's happening to a student and the structures that a student are interacting with rather than just the behaviours that the student has that might interact with those structures. So that's a really important piece of the picture. Thanks, Sally. So just a reminder, don't forget to post your comments and questions in the chat and also using the hashtag SMaRteNconf on social media, so that'd be amazing. So next up is Susannah McGowen, who is the Associate Director for Curriculum Design at Georgetown University. And I will ask you a question this time. So how can we help students to maintain engagement and motivations in our current digital virtual environments that we're all using?
Thanks, Rachel. And I'm glad to follow up on Sally, because in terms of thinking about assessment, I want to speak to what became essential for well-being and mental health in this current moment in this year since March, and what we're finding from our faculty and student surveys and focus groups at our institution at Georgetown University after the last 9 months of working remotely. And the first point is that within coursework and within our class time with students, or synchronous time with students, both students and faculty reported that maintaining connections was extremely important in any way, shape, or form. So in the US, academic staff members often have a time and space called office hours for students to come and ask questions about coursework or the modules. But we learned that the affordance and ease of use of meeting in office hours through Zoom or through Microsoft Teams was incredibly valuable. So, and to the point where academic staff realized they could meet with students in this form and not necessarily make them trek across campus or make them go from their job or their work or their internship to come back to campus to ask a question. So that maintaining those types of connections through office hours and just having that unstructured time was really valuable for both academic staff and students, and also just having connections or conversations about careers. You know, it became a space for lots of different types of conversations. The second point I wanted to point out was in my work as an educational developer, both here in the US and also in the UK, I talked a lot about active learning strategies with academic staff. And what I mean by that is providing opportunities for students to apply what they're learning in the form of assessment, as Sally just mentioned, but getting an opportunity to apply what they're learning, but also get feedback on that. And that's incredibly important to the learning process. But as I discussed with Nicola Byram a couple of years ago, when we first started talking about mental health and coursework and academic culture, these strategies, active learning strategies, are really conducive to generating a sense of belonging, generating a sense of inclusion. And so these strategies became critical in this remote learning pivot that we've made this year, especially in thinking about group work, breakout rooms, collaborative tools, but also these moments of care. The academic staff I worked with talked about surveying students, like the polls that we did at the very beginning here, as really critical moments to connect with students and check in. Finally, I just wanted to say that this moment really helped academic staff focus and narrow on what was essential to teach and to learn online or in this remote learning environment. So that goes back to the assessment. What do I really want students to focus their time and efforts on, and how can I give them feedback on that?
Thanks, that's really great, Susannah. So I'm gonna now introduce Michael. Michael Priestley is a PhD student at Durham University, and I'm going to ask him about his work and how can universities situate assessment within a whole university approach to student wellbeing.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me. So first, a whole university approach to student wellbeing is really important so that we can start to look beyond just individual and isolated mental health interventions and services to start to coordinate and embed more preventative structural and cultural change across the whole university, so that in theory we can support the better mental health and well-being for the whole university community. And the University Mental Health Charter, which was published at the end of last year by Student Minds, identifies teaching, learning and assessment as one of the core domains for developing a whole university approach. And the research that I was involved in with some amazing colleagues was using data from student staff consultations that were conducted in the development of the University Mental Health Charter. And what we essentially found was that incorporating assessment within a whole university approach fundamentally requires kind of navigating a balancing act between challenge on the one hand and threat on the other, which in a sense is sort of an extension of what some of the panelists before me have said around some of the demands of the assessment task and also the resources that students have to respond. And this is really important because existing research would suggest to us that if we can get this balancing act right, we can not only optimize student mental well-being, but also student learning. So as an overview, at the very kind of heart of this balancing act, we found that both staff and student groups were affirming that challenge is kind of a necessary part of learning, but inherent to challenge is the potential for failure. And students can kind of perceive and understand this potential for failure as a threat to their self-worth or identity, and this can manifest in stress and anxiety around assessment practices, but specifically assessment results. And going forward, the University Mental Health Charter highlights student voice and participation as a kind of key enabling theme to develop a whole university approach. And we kind of came to a similar conclusion in the sense that navigating this balancing act between kind of assessment and student well-being as part of a whole university approach is going to be different in different contexts based on different student needs. And perhaps the best way that we can understand that in a local context to adjust kind of assessment design and practices is to ensure that we have mechanisms for engaging that student voice and situating assessment as part of a whole university approach.
Amazing, thank you, Michael. I think what you're talking about a whole university approach is a good thread that brings together a lot of the different interventions, programming and kind of reframings that we've been speaking about so far. So we have had a lot of really exciting and interesting questions in the chat. So I'm going from the top, no particular order. But if you do find that your question hasn't been answered in the course of this conversation, please do tweet it and tag the relevant speakers, because they may be able to get back to you. But let's dive into some questions now. So the first question is from Rachel M in the chat. I'm very wary of recommending solely personal actions, for example, mindfulness, resilience training, etc. Structural and systematic factors are so huge, for example, financial and housing stability, social integration, etc. I wonder if anyone here has done research into these broader systematic or structural influences on mental health. So Cameron did start to answer that question in the chat, but I'll give you an opportunity now to speak to it to the rest of the audience.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, so that's a large focus of my work in terms of, these broader university aspects, I guess, looking really at the university as essentially a microsystem, but then that's sitting within a macro system. And, I think that I personally frame it from organizational health models, some of which, look at these broader factors. Unfortunately, the data's kind of still coming through and being analysed, but it certainly looks like, we do need to push very strongly for, this support for students. The nature of higher education has very clearly changed, across decades, generations. And, it's something that we can't overlook, although we often do. I don't think that gives really any answers. I think, probably for the sake of time as well, and I want to let the other panelists, chip in with their research, but certainly, yeah, it's really important, and very happy to have a much more in-depth conversation around exactly that topic if interested. And, as I say, I've got a lot of data. We've surveyed 8,000 students within Australia, and a lot of the questions surrounding those broader kind of macro system, aspects are within that survey. But there's a lot more data analysis that needs to be done with that work. So very, very keen to chat further. But I think for now, I'll leave it to the other panelists to add comments into that.
Thanks, Cameron. Michael, I know that your research looks at the whole university approach, and one element of a whole university approach is kind of what we call the living side of it, which does include those structural things like housing and finances. Is there anything that you've come across in your work that touches on that?
Yes, so there's a whole load of social and financial implications of policy that can impact on student mental health and well-being. My PhD is interested in exploring some of this wider social and institutional context that impacts on student well-being, so that we can go beyond just thinking about the individual and individual level changes. And yeah, for me, I'm really interested about the wider kind of policy narratives that assessment's situated in. So for us, thinking about that balancing act between challenge and threat, just how and why students are encouraged, or how and why students perceive assessment practices to be so threatening. And I think that is part of a wider kind of political and social narrative around education. Another thing I just wanted to flag from the paper that we did was we also identified another key theme kind of underpinning this balancing act, was the tension between kind of ideal and practical assessment. So staff were really emphasizing this in their discussions about some of the best practice that they would ideally like to implement is really difficult in the current structural demands of the university, and they have to be mindful of their own workload and well-being on these kind of huge courses. So that is probably a way too in which some of these kind of structural influences of the institution can mediate on this relationship between kind of academic culture and well-being.
And I would just say on that broader question, there is a session happening this afternoon about the future priorities of student mental health research. So if anyone is available this afternoon and wants to bring that forward into that discussion, please do. So I'm going to move on to another question now from Hamaria. How do you think universities can better deal with stress brought on from turning in assessments late or missing deadlines when it's done so accidentally? So quite a specific one, but I think quite a common experience for students. Sally, I feel like you might be well placed to speak about this.
Well, I'm not sure, but I can have a go. So they're interesting questions, aren't they? And I think one of the silver linings, if you don't mind my saying, out of COVID has been a general more compassionate and inclusive approach to assessment and extensions and deadlines being extended. And I know a lot of our disability practitioner colleagues have long been arguing for this. And for whatever reason, I think equality has played out badly in terms of equity. So I would hope that there could be considerable advances now that we won't retreat from. I'm not overly optimistic, but I don't think anything terrible's happened from being compassionate about granting extensions. So that's about the best I can offer going forward.
Thank you. And I guess a more general question on your work that we've had is, how can universities make assessment criteria easier to understand? So this person is saying that when they view many rubrics, it all just comes across as jargon and they worry about misunderstanding the criteria or not meeting it. Definitely been there. So Sally, can you offer us any advice?
And as an academic, I've been there too, and trying to assist colleagues in making rubrics clearer. So I think this is part of my idea around developing assessment literacy, and that is both for staff and for students, now that I'm allowed to say something in a little longer frame. So staff need to develop assessment literacies around how they set criteria, their consistent use of assessment verbs, their consistent naming of assessment tasks, so that it's not a complete whole new wheel every time someone comes to see a new rubric. But part of it also is setting expectations and facilitating students' engagement with those criteria, and that has to be a dialogue. And the assessment knowledge exchange that I was always very jealous of there in England at Oxford Brookes University had this wonderful 1, 2, 3 guide to helping students understand criteria, which was to conduct a workshop. And so you got students to engage with the criteria and mark themselves a couple of pieces of assessment using the criteria. Then they'd come together in a small group and do it. Then they'd calibrate that exercise of assessment judgment with a tutor, and then they discuss it again, and then a short time afterwards they would submit their own piece of assessment against those criteria. So there's been a sort of an understanding and internalising of what the criteria are. Another, and I'll stop soon, but another opportunity that I've seen well developed is having students set their own criteria with some justification for what those criteria might be. That results in deep engagement in evaluative judgment, what the measures of success for a particular task might be.
I mean, that's pretty interesting. I hope that some more places take on that model. So I've got another question, which is again a kind of about feedback on assessment. So I'm going to ask this to Susannah because I think it links to the sense of connection in some senses, but tangentially. So it's about yeah, like I said, about feedback. And do you think it's important that academics or lecturers have training on how to give useful, positive feedback, and enough, and more generally, is there enough staff and enough training for them to teach to do that well? And I guess just to add on a question on the end of that from my perspective, like how does that link to connection and this kind of virtual environment where you're not getting that day-to-day feedback of body language in a room and people nodding along to your points? There might be a bit more weight on the feedback that you get on a piece, for example, that you submit. So any thoughts on that?
Well, to that last point, in this type of environment, that's been a concern when staff are thinking about engagement. And so if we're in a Zoom room together and cameras are off, they're disoriented in terms of whether or not they're getting feedback or those visual cues from students in the room. So we're really thinking about alternative ways to make sure that everyone's present in the room without having their cameras on. And that's been a big question among staff at our institution, that there are other ways for engagement and feedback. The use of breakout rooms and collaborative tools where you put students in a breakout room and have them respond to discussion prompts within a Google document or an Office 365 document, or some of the tools people are mentioning in the chat, Padlet. Google Jamboard, another free tool, is very popular right now from this semester, just to do some brainstorming and slow down the process of problem solving, and make it visual in a way that those are the cues that students are present and working and focused, not without having their cameras on. But in terms of but then going back to the first part of your question, one of the things that I've been talking with staff about in adapting their courses to the virtual environment is also making time to give feedback. So there's some great questions in the chat about how frequent assessments should be. And one of the things that we're learning is that the students are finding they feel like their workload is increasing this past term. And there are various reasons for that, but the the academic staff also are thinking that their workload is increasing because they're making more attempts to give that feedback in this environment. So what I'm encouraging staff to do is also when they're planning their assessments for next. So when our next term is going to be remote as well. We're going to have a handful of hybrid courses that'll be on campus, but the rest of the university will be remote. So I'm also working with staff to not only schedule when their major assessments are, but also schedule when they're giving their feedback to students, because students won't find value in those assessments if they're not getting that feedback. And that's comes out of Tansy Jessup's work on TESTA, which is the transforming the experience of student assessment. She was at University of Bristol. She's a fantastic researcher, the TESTA project. I'll put the link in the chat. That's what she found in her research around the value of feedback and the motivation that it provides students to continue the work, continue that engagement, and the connection with the coursework, with the content, and because they know where they are, they can discern their progress. All of the 4 aspects that Sally mentioned around feedback literacy are in action, and so it is really important to have that sense of where you are in the process. And my last point on that, I'm sorry, I'm rambling on, but so my 2 children are in online learning environments right now, and my son is in secondary school at the moment. He's 15. He has three modules where he's not getting any feedback. He hasn't received any feedback in the last 4 weeks on any of his assignments, and it's really hard to be an educator in our household. But I can see viscerally that he has no connection with that class. He has no idea where he is or what's happening, and his motivation is reduced. There are a lot of factors for that in terms of being in a pandemic, but you can see when don't have that connection with a staff, with an academic staff member, and the value of feedback. And it is possible to work with staff at universities to talk about assessment and feedback hand in hand. I also put a link in the chat to a wonderful resource from Monash University that's connected to David Bowd about feedback loops. And there's some really useful visualizations of what that looks like. And also the courses that they examined or did research on are hybrid courses. So it's really appropriate for this particular time.
Amazing. There's so much richness in everything you said. And I hope that people can look through that, all those different resources, and see what the enabling factors are towards giving good feedback, because it clearly can be done very well. So yeah, I've got a question from the chat from Amy, which is, what does the panel think about the intricacies of implementing adjustments for students? Should we be moving towards a more inclusive way of assessing and teaching, for example, accessible presentations and handouts with access prior, alternative formats, flexibility, etc., so that specific tailored adjustments become redundant? Would anyone from the panel like to speak to that, Sally?
I can have a go at that, because we're going to be asked at the end about where we think there might be some gaps. And this was one of my 2 possible gaps. So I'm happy to have this one for free. There's just been a project commissioned out of the Cradle, CRADLE, and I'll put the link to them, research centre at Deakin University in Australia, by the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education, exactly on this topic. They're starting, it's a very small grant, it's only $40,000. I think that's about two British pounds and €1 in your translated language. But it's about reasonable adjustments for exams in the first, so assessment adjustments for exams. And the jumping off point for the research was the fact that we speak so much about inclusive and universal design for learning, inclusive curriculum design, but we don't necessarily take that to the assessment phase, and that's where, you know, where the learning rubber hits the road. So these colleagues are investigating inclusiveness in assessment and trying to do exactly what Amy has asked, and say, rather than make adjustments, could we not design better assessment where it wasn't possible, you know, where it wasn't necessary to ask for extensions or extended periods of time. And I saw a question in the chat about oral presentations and ableism. You know, so there are alternatives that can be provided, and we know that well-being is enhanced when students feel more autonomous and engaged and in control of their own learning. So we could potentially give them choice in that. But just speaking again specifically on exams, you know, you really do have to ask now why we still have time-limited examinations that are supposed to be in a big examination room where everyone's writing, answers. I think a number of us have moved away from that. I know you've had some great work in the UK from that. Sally Brown and Kay Samble have, and I'll put a link into their work into the chat, and to the Cradle blog, where the reasonable adjustments or assessment adjustments for exam work is being discussed as it progresses. So I think that's a small project, and they're interviewing students. And I suppose the other encouraging thing was their project was that they were going to interview 30 students and I think the same number of staff. In 48 hours, when they sent the call out to students, they had 150 students responding, wanting to be engaged in the work. So there's a big need and desire to make this better.
Thanks, Sally. That's really interesting. I'm going to zoom out a little bit with a question now, which is about the wider academic culture and the impact of that. Because I think that what we've spoken about so far is quite a few different sort of individual practices and interventions and policies that can be helpful. So let's just kind of step back for a second. So yeah, how does the wider academic culture impact all of this? So we know that academics across the UK are really burnt out and exhausted at the moment. And how do we, and this is from an academic, how do we do well by our students when we run out of energy? And how do we balance, get this balance to support academics to have capacity to be creative, to have capacity to do all of these really good practices that we've spoken about? So I might ask Cameron first on this, and then move on to Michael, and then open it to the floor more generally.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I've actually just done some research looking at students' perceptions of their instructors' mental well-being. And that was a kind of a different viewpoint, but my main argument there and what the results strongly show is that, you know, we need to focus on, clearly we need to focus on mental well-being for the sake of its importance naturally for instructors. But also there's an argument that can be made there to, you know, to strengthen that case for the importance of looking at that, because mental well-being of instructors also, you know, directly and indirectly influences student well-being. So there's kind of two key arguments that are really strong to be made in that respect. I guess the second kind of main thing that is really worth mentioning when we're talking about staff well-being is to look at this concept called a psychosocial safety climate. Essentially, in a nutshell, what that means is, does the university prioritise mental well-being? And that kind of runs both ways. If there's a culture where students' well-being is being supported, then somewhat indirectly, staff well-being is going to be supported too, because that culture is prioritising well-being. And then the flip side exists as well. If we're optimising staff well-being, we're also focusing on student well-being. So I've always said, and the research that I've, you know, conducted really strongly shows, we can't separate the two. If we're just looking at one side of that piece, then we're missing a massive, you know, part that just can't be separated. That, you know, I guess, as Sally mentioned, you know, we've got gaps in the research. And I think a lot of the gap is not necessarily how can we best support students and staff wellbeing. It's more about how can we make that priority. And that's the real hard question. And that's the question that I'll kind of leave everyone to think about, you know, what does that mean for their own institution? Because I don't have the answer to that. But it's really, you know, overall about prioritization of student and staff wellbeing, both sides of the coin.
Thank you, Cameron. And I think your research is going to be sort of published as you go along. Some people are asking about where they can find out more about your research. So yeah, I think, yeah.
Definitely. Firstly, email me, and I don't know if emails have been provided, but if so, you know, I'm sure someone from the team is happy to send that out. Otherwise, Cameron John Williams on Google Scholar, and it's very much, as Nicola just said, a matter of watch this space. During my PhD, literally on this topic, moment, so hopefully there'll be more to read soon.
Brilliant, thank you. Michael, I'll pass it to you as well for any thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It just incidentally is that the same team that worked on that paper and now going forward, we're kind of exploring this a little bit further, because we were really interested by this tension between kind of what staff were bringing out in their consultations about practical versus ideal assessment, and exactly the way that's been described, and how staff are supported with their own workload and well-being to be able to implement changes that can benefit student well-being through teaching, learning and assessment. So that's something that we're kind of going forward interested in exploring as to how we can kind of benefit both staff well-being and student well-being. I guess just kind of, I alluded to it before, and it's something that I'm become really interested in since working on this research, is just thinking, going back to your question about the wider academic culture and how that kind of mediates some of this, and thinking that the core tension or balancing act that we identified was between challenge and threat, and just thinking about how the academic culture in higher education mediates some of that, and how students can perceive and understand kind of assessment practices to be a huge threat to their identity and sense of self-worth. And I think that raises some kind of wider questions, as you say, beyond just interventions and kind of like specific changes, to actually thinking really carefully about how we think about and talk about learning within our assessment policies and practices.
Thanks, Michael. That's really interesting. I wonder if, and no pressure if there's an answer to this, but Sally and Susannah, just to kind of extend on this question of the academic environment, one thing that I hear in the question of burnout and exhaustion is about precarity of work, limited competition for roles, things like that, that are like genuine threats to people's livelihoods. Can you speak to that at all, and how, you know, how that does have a real impact on people's health and well-being? Susannah, you're nodding a lot. Would you like to come in?
Do you mean parity of work among lecturers?
Yeah, so thinking about, you know, lecturers and academics are burnt out and exhausted, not just because, you know, for reasons, you know, not just the way that they're looking at the problem. I mean, yeah, so if you might want to speak to that, Paul.
I can have a go, Suzanne.
Thank you, Sally. I'm going to collect my thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, no, and it's a difficult subject, and I think as where the sector is, and I can only speak from my environment, and it may be different over there, and I do watch over there, watch you all. Is I think there's been a more compassionate approach both from staff and students. So everyone's accepting, I think, that everyone's doing the best they can in difficult circumstances. And when we do extend that thinking out, understanding that everyone's in the same position. So if you're finding it difficult to find a quiet place at home to teach, students are finding it difficult to find a quiet place at home if they have a home, and I do understand that's potentially a problem, to do their learning. We have a big digital divide over here, and I sense that it's much the same potentially in the UK. So our regional and remote students have been quite impacted by the ability, you know, just download speeds and what they can access online. So, but you've got staff in those situations who are also trying to conduct Zooms. I mean, I know I've been in my own home and we've had 3 of us trying to do Zoom at the same time, and the broadband just really won't tolerate it. And we're in the middle of the city, so we're not regional and remote. So I suppose it's a rambling way of saying that we are very much all in this together. The precarity of employment has been a big issue in Australia. The government, for whatever reason, seems to have turned its face against higher education and has ruled us out 3 times of getting support for the institutions. And we've lost Some estimates are around 17,000 colleagues over the course of the last few months, particularly with the international student download. And the worry now for next year for a large number of colleagues is in reduced funding circumstances. And there's also been a package of legislation that's gone through that hasn't provided any more funding, if I could put it even at its kindest. Colleagues are now starting to worry about how they're going to deliver to the extent that they expect of themselves, because they want to do the right thing. Most academics do try to do the right thing in very reduced circumstances. I'm sorry, that was a bit rambling, but it's a very delicate and serious issue. And I think what our colleagues are appreciating is that students are being kind to them in return and have been somewhat forgiving. I'm not quite sure how long that will last, because I'm keenly aware that students are paying significant amounts of money for the education that they may or may not feel they're getting value for.
Thank you, Sally. I think that's probably, yeah, quite a good summary of the time that we're in at the moment. Susannah, do you want to add anything?
The only thing I could possibly add to the wonderful words of Sally would be that the burnout, it has been acute in our particular context, especially related to our presidential election. I would say that was the lowest moment for everyone in our institution in terms of anticipating the week of the presidential election in the US. And so we had a conversation, I facilitated a conversation with academic staff. The Friday prior to that week, there were over 100 academic staff members in the Zoom room on a Friday afternoon, late Friday afternoon, when we're all burnt out, extremely tired. It's past that midterm point. And we talked about strategies for coping with that week, regardless of the results. And so in terms of, and that was canceling, people canceled classes, people reduced assignments, students were requesting to maintain classes. They still wanted to connect, they just didn't want to do any coursework before the classes, which I think is really important, that there was that open communication between academic staff and students. And so, and we're also, again, I mentioned we're going into a term where we don't have any breaks. We'll have one break at the end of March, but normally we have, similar to bank holiday weekends, we have multiple of those during a term, but we're not going to have any of those. So now we're trying to brace ourselves for another term with extremely burnt out staff and students. And again, it's going back to what is really essential to this type of learning experience and how can we maintain this engagement at this point in time that will get us to the next autumn term where things might resemble might resemble normalcy again. So it's a situation we don't have a lot of answers to at the moment, but we're all in the same situation. And as long as we acknowledge that and articulate that and have these conversations about strategies and conversations, that's most valuable for academic staff.
Thank you.
I'm very sorry, Rachel. May I just add one further thing? Both Susannah and I spoke about academic staff because I think that's what the question was directed towards. But I don't want to leave this conversation leave this point without also referring to what we in Australia would call professional staff. So equity practitioners, disability practitioners, particularly technology enhanced learning advisors, who have all also suffered extraordinary burnout because they've been trying to support and the emotional labour that we feel, that academics feel with students, the technology enhanced learning staff have felt with academics, and the equity and the disability practitioners have felt with their own students. So just over the course of the last 3 or 4 weeks, I've sort of done a little speaking circuit talking to professional staff, so student support staff, around fitting their own oxygen mask first so that they're in a position to help others, help them, so looking after your own mental health, which is what we would say to students as well before they tackle their other work. So I just didn't want to leave that discussion without drawing attention to professional staff.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's really helpful. I think what I'm hearing from all of this is that there's this kind of interim need to build community and build strategies within staff to kind of cope and manage and adjust to various kind of crises that are unfolding in our world. But also, I think we've seen a debate in the UK a little bit about trauma-informed responses. And I think that what I'm hearing from this a little bit is like, how can we look specifically to trauma-informed responses around assessment, and how might that, you know, feed into the feedback process? Susannah, I think this was something you were speaking about before. Is there anything you'd like to say about that?
I was just pulling up the article from a colleague of mine who's a neuroscientist who writes and speaks a lot about trauma-informed pedagogy in terms of what our physiological effects of burnout might have an impact on our ability to focus and concentrate. But it's controversial. It's not. It's and rightly so in terms of questioning the effects. But I do think if you read that article, you would recognize certain moments where you might feel scattered, you might feel unorganized, or I'm sure we've all had those moments in the last couple of months where you might need to take a step back, turn off the Zoom or the Microsoft Teams and resume your work. But it is, the way that my colleague writes about it is that if you take some of these aspects into consideration, and again, it goes back to assessment, it's really understanding what is the purpose of what you're trying to ask students to demonstrate in terms of what they're learning. So she's trying to really help narrow and focus what it is we're doing within our teaching and learning processes, but taking into account the different ways that our current environment is affecting us. And that might be a US specific context given the past year in terms of the pandemic, in terms of the racial injustices that we're experiencing, as well as this chaotic presidential election that just adds layers and layers of uncertainty to a particular context, and that seeps into our classrooms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so much interesting and different angles we can take here. I just kind of wanted to give a moment of hope, which is, I think that we have this huge movement around student mental health, and it's a movement that identifies often the things that are stressful and the things that are difficult for people, and it has so much potential to respond and give people the tools to get through that and to thrive. But it also has this potential to highlight what the problems are and to kind of call for some of those problems to be solved in order to help with all of our mental health. So that's just kind of my call to arms, I suppose. What can we name as a movement that perhaps might seem out of our remit of control, but we might be able to ask for from those in power. So I'm actually just gonna end at that point, because I think we've zoomed out, and if I ask another small question here, it might seem a bit ill at odds. So we're at a point now where we've talked about detailed interventions, we've talked about culture, we've talked about different ways of responding to COVID, we've talked about connection, and we've talked about whole university approaches, we've talked about workshops. We have a whole toolkit here at our disposal, so I do really call on people to look through the chat and look at those articles and find out more. But for now, I'm going to ask each panelist to speak about what the gaps are in the research and what's one thing in relation to a topic that we've spoken about that they'd really love to research and find out more about. So would anyone like to kick us off? Cameron, you are unmuted, so I'm going to take that.
That's all right.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I'll start. Yeah, I mean, one question is really obviously hard to pin down, but I think for me, it's about, you know, and Catherine raises really good points. I mean, her work around this, her writings around this certainly, you know, are really interesting and thought-provoking, and there's a lot of value to it. But I think that it's about looking at the role of a university in terms of mental health. So, there's this question of, are universities, there to address mental health difficulties, challenges, trauma, or are mental health universities there to really provide mentally well education and that kind of thing? And I think that the answer, quite possibly can be both. But I think that, we do need a focus on all of these really broad factors. What that then means is a gap is more research around that. But as I said before, it's not just research on what can we do to support students. I think we have a fairly good understanding at this point. I think what we need now is practical implementation-based science, which looks at how do we take what we already know and legitimately test it in a scientific manner to look at then how can we optimize the university culture. It's a big ask, but that's why we've got all of you people, amazing people on the chat to to help us out with all of this. So yeah, good luck in your journeys on mental wellbeing.
Thanks, Cameron. And that just reminds me to signpost people to the conversation that happened, I think, earlier today on what works for student wellbeing, that looks at that kind of outcome measured and sort of rigorous response to the types of interventions that can do well. Sally, Michael, Susannah, would any of you like to throw in your hat in the ring?
I'll have a go. I had 2 prepared answers. I've used one of them. I'm going to use my second one. It's the question, I think, about helping students to recover well from academic failure and turning failure into a supported learning opportunity. We know that there's a strong relationship between failure and withdrawal. There's been, again, some good recent research in Australia, or good but sobering bad recent research in Australia that shows there's a strong relationship between failure and withdrawal, and 1 in 3 students who failed at least one subject withdrew, compared with 1 in 11 who passed everything. But I think the research opportunity here is to work with students who have failed, and often many of them do persist and succeed. So to find out from what we can learn from their experiences and the strategies that they used to help them get through, to persist. And we always do talk, failure is freedom to fail and all that, but it's often easier said than done. And I think if we did that on a more informed basis, I think we would probably do all of ourselves a bit of a service. So that's my second one.
Thanks, Sally.
I would probably do a similar study for staff and academic staff and professional staff. I have been interviewing, I'm collecting data, but there's no time to actually properly analyze it. So I'm looking forward to possibly next summer. I'm doing interviews with academic staff about their experiences at this particular moment. And I'm really with an eye towards thinking of what are the practices that we can continue using, that we can see as beneficial for learning, but also for those moments of belonging and inclusion. And that's what I would like to identify going forward, because Rachel, I do share in your sense of hope and optimism that this past year has allowed multiple opportunities to dismantle the way education had been persisting for years, if not centuries. And it's been a really unique time to understand what our processes are, ask the questions about academic culture, and I'd like to have the time and to reflect and properly analyze what that looks like based on all of the focus group data and interview data that we're collecting at the moment.
Oh, we'll all look forward to that. No pressure.
So I'm struggling a little bit because there's just there's so many areas that I would be interested to research further, and I think that there's been a growing interest in this area, which is fantastic. But with that is the risk that lots of things are implemented without a very secure evidence base. So I kind of agree with Cameron that one of the priorities needs to be identifying and understanding how we can evaluate the impact of some of these changes that we're suggesting. I also just think, for me, I'd like a little bit more conceptual work around emotion in learning, and there is some really good stuff going on in this space, but just getting kind of revisiting this idea of a balancing act almost, and understanding that obviously there are some emotions that we might think of as negative, such as uncertainty and anxiety and stress, that are motivators for learning, and which are kind of a normal part of learning, and just getting a little bit clearer about that, I think, for me, and where the boundaries are when that becomes unhelpful, and when that's facilitative of learning.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. So thank you so much for everyone speaking. I'm going to, yeah, and just massive thanks to all the speakers to cover that range of questions. We're hoping to kind of go through the chat and hear all the other questions. But again, if you do want to tweet them to get to continue the conversation, please do. But yeah, it's been a pleasure to share all of you. I'm going to pass on to Lesley now, who's going to speak about the next part of this session.